What needs to be done now to make sure future major storms don't cause billions more in damage to homes, business, and infrastructure? Albert Betts is Executive Director of the Insurance Council of Texas. Good to have you here. And Dr. Firas Saleh is Senior Engineer and Professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology. Good to have you here, sir.
Thank you.
Houston's had a real building boom, right, in the last 10 years. How many new homes have been built in what we know is a floodplain?
If you look at what's happening in Houston or in the Harris County, which includes Houston, you have, since 2010, you have more than 9,000 buildings in a 100-year floodplain, which is massive, massive buildings. From 1993 to 2010, you had approximately 30% of your wetlands, of the wetlands in Houston, in that area that have been converted entirely to parking lots and buildings. These wetlands are useful in absorbing water. It's not going to mitigate something like what happened, but at least you would have less flood levels in your areas. Add to that the aging infrastructure. Add to that the stressors we're facing from sea level rise. Add to that the drainage system in the area, and so on. And you would have I would like to say
a human tragedy of epic proportions.
Human tragedy, a perfect recipe for a disaster.
Mr. Betts, when it comes to insurance, a lot of these losses are going to be uninsured because flood penetration rates are so low in Texas, right? I mean, what's going to happen there?
You know, that's one of the biggest problems. And let me first send my condolences and prayers to the folks in Houston, Beaumont, et cetera, who have suffered losses. This is a tragedy unseen here, unseen anywhere in the U.S. lately. And the big concern is those folks, probably 4 out of 5, who don't have flood insurance, who thought they weren't prone to flooding or weren't concerned or thought it was too expensive and didn't buy the flood insurance and now are faced with a total loss. There's some programs through FEMA that may provide some disaster assistance, but in terms of paying for their home, those folks are going to have to look in their own pockets now, and that's a tragedy. I saw a figure today that actually since the last flood in Houston, we had fewer people buying flood insurance.
Right. And Dr. Saleh highlights or implies, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it raises a question with me. Why were so many homes built in a floodplain in the first place? And what codes are there that would have prevented this? Are there any?
Well, in Texas, 254 counties, there is no statewide building code. Each individual county or city may have its own building code requirements. And keep in mind, for a flood, there's no building code that can stop a flood from washing away a home. The question becomes economic development. Texas is a booming economy. Thousands are moving to Texas each day. And so it's a balance between the need to accommodate the growth, the economic energy that's here in Texas, and also accommodate the safety.
But Albert, I mean, this is going to, at the risk of sounding callous, I mean, this really focuses the question on whether or not we should permit homes to be built, period, in these areas. And to your point about no statewide building requirements, there are building requirements in Texas which allow this to happen. In Corpus Christi, for instance, the codes reflect the national standards minus the requirement that homes be built 1 foot above the expected 100-year flood levels. So in Corpus Christi, you can build those homes. Should we tighten that up so that people aren't stuck in this situation in the future?
Well, I think that's going to be one of the discussions after the storm, and that's probably going to happen in communities like Houston, Port Arthur, Beaumont. Each community is going to have to look at its building code standards, make decisions about what they want to do going forward. How can they keep their citizens safe? How can we avoid these kind of losses? But again, balance that against the need for economic growth.
You know, the flood insurance program sells insurance at a deeply discounted rate. I wonder if that, in some ways, incentivizes people to build in places where they shouldn't be because they don't actually absorb the costs of what it really means to live in a floodplain. I mean, what that means is, I look at more than 50% of the homes insured by the National Flood Insurance Program are in Florida and Texas. That means 48 other states subsidize below-cost flood insurance for people in Texas, in Florida. I mean, if that, I would think you're at the Insurance Association, if private insurance were there, maybe they'd say things like, you know what, we're not actually going to insure this home unless you build it higher, unless the ratio of, you know, grasslands to concrete is different.
Or
So
your
that
premium is higher.
Or your premium is higher, and that would be a natural disincentive to building in those areas. Should the private sector and private insurance be more pervasive? Would that help prevent human tragedy?
Well, keep in mind, the private sector is there writing homeowners coverage. Flood insurance is not written generally by the private sector.
Right, that's my point.
Yeah, you're right. The flood insurance at the national level is much lower than it would be if the private sector wrote it. Here's the problem. Let me just be honest. If the private sector wrote it at the price for the risk that comes with some of these areas, unfortunately, consumers would not be able to afford it. And that impacts the ability of people to live and work and grow in those areas.
You see the problem here, Dr. Saleh? A legislator doesn't want to change the rules because they don't want a smaller constituency. They want people to move to their state, right?
So clearly, there's no one solution that fits all in this situation. The solution has to be holistic. It's going to be taking years. It's going to take years, billions of dollars, massive investment. It's going to take investment in operational flood forecasting, in communicating that forecast to the public, because there's a difference between issuing a forecast and telling people what that means. It's going to take massive investment in infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, and massive investment in research. We have the top schools in the world. We have the best engineering and construction companies in the world, and I think we can do that. We just need some vision on that, and we need to have investment at the federal, state, local, and
in addition to
private
what's going
sector.
on in terms of how you build buildings, et cetera, but
Absolutely.
something like a coastal spine?
So the buildings we have, so for example, if you want to design a dam or a drainage system, you go back, you take 100 years worth of data, and you assume climate stationarity, which means nothing is going to change in the future.
Right.
Well, guess what? That's going to change in the future. And we are witnessing more frequency and intensity in these storms. Houston had 300-year or worse storms in 3 successive years. So
Which means it's not 300-year storms.
They need to need to absolutely redefine that definition.
Mr. Betts, you guys are going to have a tough job down there. We really appreciate it. Insurance is going to be, we know, a very big issue considering what's just happened there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, ma'am.
You too, Dr. Saleh.
Thank you. Thank you.
When we come back.